Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the Asia Global Dialogue on global affairs. The topic is prospects for multilateralism. We can't have a better a panel than three stars. First, Dr. Richard Haass, CEO of the president of the Council for Foreign Relations, based in New York, the leading authority. I read every single copy of Foreign Affairs that comes out, including articles by Richard Haass. Then we have Mr. Takeshi Niinami, Chief Executive of Suntory Holdings Limited, an advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister on many issues. Then we have Dr. Feng, Executive Director, China Center for Collaborative Studies, South China Sea at Nanjing University. We're short of time, so I'm just going to go straight into the topic. Multilateralism has been the anchor of US foreign policy since the Second World War. That's over 70 years. So in the last 4 years, the Trump administration has moved away from that position towards bilateralism. And so the key question is, with the incoming Biden administration, will America go back to multilateralism? And I think that's the issue that Dr. Richard Haass is, I would say, the leading expert on, because the Council of Foreign Affairs has a very strong stance on this issue. Richard, can you, tell us, how do you think the Biden administration will handle the issue of multilateralism in the next 4 years, and particularly the relationships with China?
There we go. Good to be with you, sir. Good to be with you, Andrew. Good to be with two such distinguished others, including my good friend Tak. Let me give you a good news, bad news situation, then I'll get to the question of China. The good news is, I think it's safe to predict that the Biden administration will be much more inclined to embrace multilateralism. In that sense, it'll be much more like presidents going from Truman through Obama. The Trump administration, as you said, on some occasions was bilateralist. On some occasions, it was unilateral. On some occasions, it was isolationist. I believe the Biden administration will prove to be internationalist and multilateral. And we'll see that in terms of alliances, willing to work with allies rather than spend most of our time criticizing them. And we'll rejoin, I think very early on, we'll rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, we'll rejoin the World Health Organization, and so forth. Less clear is what it's going to do with something like the Iran nuclear agreement, but let's put that aside. But the first answer, which I think is good news, is that this administration, the new administration, will be multilateralist. And the reason that's good news is there's nothing the United States can do better by itself than with others. A lot of this architecture has served us in the world very well. And we're obviously living in an age of multiple threats and challenges, and the United States needs partners. So for all these reasons, that's the good news. The not so good news, also known as the bad news, is that many of these multilateral arrangements or institutions are flawed. Virtually every one of them is inadequate. In some cases, somewhat inadequate. In some cases, fundamentally inadequate. So even if the United States embraces them, re-enters them, works with them, it's still going to be inadequate. So the real question is not whether simply we get involved, but towards what end. And then that's not then just about us. Then it's about everybody else. One of the phrases, Andrew, people always use is international community. Well, the honest truth is there isn't an international community. That may be a goal. One day, hopefully there'll be one, but right now there isn't one. So the real question is in dealing with every regional challenge or every global challenge, can we either improve the institutions that do exist so they are in a better position to meet the challenge, the Paris process, so it can better meet climate challenges, the World Health Organization, which has clearly failed in dealing with COVID-19. There really is nothing to join when it comes to structuring and regulating the internet, the digital domain. The regional frameworks for dealing with Iran and North Korea are seriously inadequate. The World Trade Organization, the last round of global trade talks went nowhere. So there the world is breaking up into other groupings. And that, by the way, might be the one area of multilateralism the new administration is not so enthusiastic about. We can talk more about that if you would like to. You asked me about China, so let me quickly segue to China. I do think there will be a more multilateral approach to China. I think the United States will work more closely with Japan, South Korea, Australia, India. A lot of that, though, was in process under this administration. I think there'll be much more cooperation with Europe, particularly on the technology side of relations with China. So I think it'll continue to be a difficult relationship between the United States and China. Don't get me wrong. It will be difficult in every realm: security, human rights, and economics. In every realm, it will be a difficult relationship. And I do think the American approach, though, will be much more to approach China with others, whether they are formal allies or partners or in various institutions. You're on mute, Andrew.
Why it went on mute. Great, Richard. That's the first-rate summing up of a very difficult position. I like your good news. I also like your bad news. I think that's very realistic. I think it's very important that everybody put things on the table and have a very frank discussion how to move towards multilateralism, okay? I mean, you know, all partnerships have some quarrels. That's fine. I mean, the world has many noises. Tak, why don't you give us some take on your response to what Richard has stated about the American position, and how do you see Japan taking multilateralism forward?
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, it's a great honor to be here to be with the distinguished panel, and good to see you, everybody. First of all, as Richard mentioned, talked about, we like the policy of President-elect Biden's shift back towards multilateralism and the intention to re-engage international community, such as global institutions like WTO. But there will be a huge challenge from possibly, Republican Senate, because we are sure that it's astonishing fact that President Trump received lots of support, very close to just below 50% of the United States populace, which means, you know, divided nation. That's quite evident. Having said that, let me touch upon the U.S. relation with Japan. It's been very well and solid, and that will be continued even, you know, new administration led by President-elect Biden. And Japan has been playing a flag bearer of free trade. I think we've been, to some extent, feeling the vacuum created by President Trump. And we definitely want to work with the United States furthermore to fill the gap, vacuum together if we can. But that's the question. And let me touch upon the current Japan's stance to further the relationship with the United States. The first meeting you recall, between President-elect Biden and Prime Minister Suga has been so successful. The reason is President-elect Biden affirmed that the US-Japan Security Treaty applies the Senkaku Islands. That's the most important statement which we received. So that's a good beginning to further the relationship with the United States. And Japan's role, though I know US will not be able to join the TPP very soon, or maybe in the future that will happen. Our role is to connect the United States with the TPP countries, possibly RCEP countries, not to exclude the US presence. And I think that needs lots of effort of Japan and with the like-minded countries like Australia, New Zealand, and TPP countries. And it's a good thing that RCEP will be materialized. But my concern is China will leading multilateralism using the RCEP. So check and balance is very much needed. I definitely like the Chinese move to participate in the multilateralism. But China is too huge in terms of economic size and the huge influence of power to the world. So we want to work together with us, but we have to think how we can deal with the trade and investment with the fair rules. And Japan wants to play such a role.
That's fantastic. Tak, I think you've reiterated great commitment of Japan to multilateralism, great commitment to free trade. And I think on that area, actually, I used to think that everybody was on board until the Trump administration started, as Richard was saying, either isolationism, bilateralism, or monolateralism, put it this way, or unilateralism. So trade is going to be a very great important issue. And I think I want to come back to this because, I myself am all for free trade. The only question is how do you define it and how do you have a level playing field? Why don't we now move to Dr. Zhu Feng? Dr. Zhu, can you give us your reaction to Richard and Tak and give us some views on how you think China is going to react towards multilateralism?
You're on mute, Dr. Zhu.
Yeah, if we looking at the Chinese foreign policy vocabulary, there's no word which will be prevailing more than the multilateralism and the global governance. I think when the Beijing talk that way, I think somehow it is sincere because full engagement to multilateralism is some sort of a very useful Chinese path to avoid isolation, avoid just the further containment from the US and the other great power in the world. But on the other hand, China also now is growing and getting bigger. And it seems that China just like some sort of, let's say, telephone in sitting room. So on any multilateral occasions, there's no way Beijing could be neglected. But on the other hand, we will see how the China's commitment to the multilateralism could go more effective and internationally expectable. Of course, it's a question. By nature, China remains largely a transformative power. So Richard mentioned, for example, Biden's full engagement to multilateralism is a very positive signal because I consider multilateral occasion will not just bring the both power into the contact and dialogue. The most important thing, it will create the new room for Washington, Beijing to cooperate. I think one of the very chilling and very severe deterioration of US-China relations is where almost suspend all level of the contacts and communications. The Trump administration just moved very unilaterally and taking China as a punchbag. So then Biden's return to multilateralism will be a very positive driver to just approach our very complicated but important relations. But the problem is, I see the multilateralism is not just a platform. Most importantly, multilateralism is commitment and convictions. Why the multilateralism is fading down so severely? Most important reason is Trump administration betrayed Americans' long-held liberal internationalism, and also unilaterally withdrew its commitment. Richard also just mentioned, for example, WHO hasn't just proved to be effective in boosting the international community. But I have to say one of the reasons behind that is Trump's very, very disastrously, withdrawal from WHO. So then I think multilateralism proved to be is inherently flawed, because such an international institution should just proceeding together with the great cooperation and hand in hand, working together. So then I really hope under Biden, China, Japan, US as well, we can just have to re-engage in a great dynamic into the multilateral course. Then on the other hand, I think Takeshi also very powerfully mentioned Japan's role of some sort of a checking and a balancing vis-a-vis China. I think, to be honest, it's very positive for my country to just move ahead in a way more, complying with the international expectation. So my concern is not how such a counterbalancing China will just unfolding. My concern is such a counterbalancing couldn't just go just the way say antagonizing the China or containing China. That will be very, very welcome and positive. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really excellent three opening remarks. I think all of you, the three of you, have summed it up very, very well. Number one, good news. The incoming Biden administration is leaning towards multilateralism. Okay, and the area that I hear from Richard is that in certain areas there are serious concerns, and we accept that. Japan has stated it's for multilateralism and for free trade. And Dr. Zhu, you have stated China's position also for multilateralism, but want much more respect and how do you play by the rules in the new environment. Now, Richard, the good news is that the Biden administration, as I hear him talk, is for healing. And we're in for a healing period because it's not just for America, but for the global multilateralism, because that's having a lot of shocks. Now, you raised the issue about institutions, and I totally agree with you. As multilateralism, the rise of other powers into the game, how do you handle these adequacy of institutions to handle global affairs is a serious issue. Now, you already stated, and Hillary was already had stated also, she wasn't for TPP, right? And so the result is China has indicated, well, or has already signed RCEP and has indicated they want to join CPTPP. What is America's stance on this, and what is America's stance on WTO? Richard?
Sorry, thank you. Let me make two general points, and then I'll try to address your specific concerns. One is multilateralism is not an end in itself. Multilateralism is simply a means to an end. It has the potential to be an effective approach to international relations, to promoting order but it's just that, it has potential. It depends on the willingness and the ability of governments to work together. So I think we just need to be realistic. So everybody can sit here and say they think multilateralism is wonderful in principle, but the question is, will it be effective in practice? And in many cases, recent history suggests not. So I just think we have to be sober about the subject. And secondly, and taking the case of China, I'm going to be critical here, and I hope Dr. Zhu is not offended. I mean, the World Health Organization failed with COVID-19 long before the American withdrawal. I was against the American withdrawal, don't get me wrong, but the World Health Organization failed in December and January in dealing with COVID-19. The United States was involved at the time. That was more on China, and that was more on the World Health Organization. The Paris Climate Agreement is all about the voluntary actions of the countries that are part of it. The question there, in the case of China, if one looks at its expansion of coal plants, there's nothing that the Paris multilateral arrangements can do to limit that. And by the way, the world has totally failed to limit what Brazil is doing and destroying the Amazon rainforest, which is having tremendous negative impact on our efforts to combat climate change. The World Trade Organization, not only did the last round of talks fail, but the World Trade Organization can't deal with many of the most pressing challenges to free trade, including, among other things, China's unwillingness to respect intellectual property. So again, I just think we need to be stone cold sober, as we say, about multilateralism in practice rather than as a principle for how to deal with international relations. In terms of the WTO, I think the United States over the last few years has made an error in working against the functioning of the so-called adjudication panel, the legal panel of the WTO. I'm pretty sure that will now end. I think the United States will once again allow that to go forward. But I don't see the WTO in the short run as the principal venue for global, for trade talks. Things like RCEP, TPP, the USMCA, and so forth. I think it's going to be smaller multilateral, trilateral, bilateral groupings that will be the principal vehicles for advancing global trade. Indeed, I thought it was quite interesting that what was TPP, many of the ideas in that became the principal ideas for the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. We used those ideas and brought them into another agreement. And I like that idea. I like the idea that these agreements become almost laboratories of innovation. And when we find good things in one agreement, we introduce them into another. But I think there's a larger point here. And my larger point is I think we need to understand multilateralism in ways that are different than the WTO or the Paris Climate Agreement, or what I would call in ways that are different than the UN General Assembly. Multilateralism is rarely, if ever, going to be universalism with 193 countries there, because the 193 countries can't agree on anything. And the best chance for multilateralism is much smaller groupings. Years ago, I developed the phrase coalitions of the willing, but some types of coalitions where you bring together those parties that are willing and able to work together to deal with a certain challenge. And I'd say one other thing, and then I'll stop, Andrew. I think we've also reached an era of multilateralism where the participants will not simply be governments. If you were going to have a meeting today to deal with COVID-19, you would obviously have to have the Gates Foundation. You would need the pharmaceutical companies. You would need the small companies, the biogen companies like Moderna and others that are developing vaccines or therapeutics or tests. Similarly, if you were going to have a multilateral meeting to deal with the internet, you couldn't just have governments. You'd have to have Google and Twitter and Facebook and Apple and others. So I think we've reached a point in history where we need multilateralism. It has to include entities other than nation states. And probably if it's going to succeed, it's going to have to be much smaller than anything that begins to resemble the UN General Assembly.
Richard, that's fabulous. Thank you for being frank and really to the point. If I hear you right, multilateralism has now to take care of the older model was all about state versus market. And today there is a new force, civil society. How the hell do you take into consideration civil society in which the foundations, the NGOs, the civil voices are as strong as either the state or the market, I mean, the for-profit issues. And therefore, the institutions are creaking at the seams in dealing with this. But I want to give Dr. Zhu a chance to respond to your criticism, and then we can open up to the floor. And Tak, if you have a point you would like to make, let's do that. First, Dr. Zhu.
Thank you, Andrew. Actually, not much criticism. I really like Richard's thoughts. I'm a professor of international relations, both international history and international theory, also very strongly assumed multilateralism is a principle, is a commitment, but the real world is very acute. For example, how a country committed to the multilateralism largely depends on how powerful they are, in some sort of a crafting the own policy. So then multilateralism and great power usually is some sort of a contradiction. So then basically I see a couple of factors should have always been served better if we want the multilateralism just proceeding very well. First is great power competition and great power cooperation. Multilateralism is always a platform where great power competition could just have a heating up. Then another very important principle is also serving underlying element is great powers, self-restraint. Then we'll see today's world has never been stuck into punch off the global issues, pandemic, climate change, and emission reduction. There's no single power, no matter how powerful you are, could just tackle such a things alone. So then we need multilateralism. But traditionally, multilateralism is some sort of complementary to international relations. But today, as Andrew, you just mentioned, civil society and impending global issues, a lot of, we say, such international insafety and insecurity, then we will see greater multilateralism serve as a very dynamic forefront, which could just force great power to comply. So then my view is this. US usually serve a leader in promoting the multilateralism around the world. But the problem is such a long American story of multilateral promotion is also there's, let's say, indispensable part. US also will be just a stay on leadership. US also will have its own choice. So then it's also very, very realistic. But from a Chinese perspective, I always believe full engagement to the multilateralism is not a way China could just have a win the respect. Most important, it's also very, very important. I think some sort of a positive implication for China to have image building and the national interests, realization. So then I really hope multilateralism is a great channel where the two powers could just have to re-engage each other. But the problem is the world is always realistic. So I never just delusional. So multilateralism is really some sort of central elements of Americans' foreign policy. Then multilateralism also will offer the framework where the US and China could just have a fall short of their great power competition. Multilateralism is a new front where greater partition is heating up. Thank you.
That's very good. Thank you very much. Tak, would you comment on the earlier discussion and particularly your views on WTO?
Yeah, couple points. I agree with Richard. I think WTO, we should discuss how to make it a function, but I don't think we should not be too idealistic about its efficacy, but it will be in the future. But definitely 2 points. One is multilateralism should be accomplished by the regional agreements like RCEP and TPP, and those should be platforms, and that will create rules. RCEP is based on a low standard, but should be evolving toward the high standard, because it's better to start anyway, and just like we have to move toward the level of the TPP with the high standard. Second point is, as a showcase of multilateralism, I agree with the Feng. I think sustainability, Richard, I think you're right. Sustainability, it's a standard rule. We can't, discuss anymore. That's a must. And that needs lots of, efforts of big, countries and, many countries. That will be a kind of platform of multilateralism in the future and a new multilateralism. But in having said that, I won't expect China to take some key responsibility as a big power together with the United States. That's the issue. I don't think China is ready always not to take the global responsibility as a big power. China is already big power. That's what we have to pursue. How China will bring into the that role of Feng. I think we expect that role. To give the lots of supports to many countries instead of pursuing hegemony we see in this world.
Thank you, Tak. That's very helpful. Let me try and sum up the points as I see it. The three of you all agree that multilateralism in the old manner can't function. What is happening now is that regional or bilateral amongst the great powers understanding in different pockets will try to move race to the top rather than to a race to the bottom. That part I think everybody agrees on. But the issue, and this is the question by Michael Webb from New Zealand. The issue is this: to what extent does the panel see bilateral issues between US and China affecting the position of other states in the region in their dealings with each other, i.e. pressure to take sides between one or the other, and how will this affect multilateralism in the region? I think this is a very good question. Anybody can, all three of you can try and answer this question.
Yeah, Andrew, I think a most formidable test for the moment is the CPTPP's enlargement and inclusion. So then the Chinese top leader Xi Jinping, to be honest, very surprisingly mentioned China would like to join the CPTPP. Because when I say it is a surprise to me, because the CPTPP has a very high threshold. If China want to get in, it will be a big, push for China's some sort of, we say, overarching systemic reform in terms of the market, accommodation to the CPTPP's standards. But the problem is, as I mentioned, so then such a engagement to the multilateralism and international community as well usually serve a very important driver to get the Beijing, to move ahead. So then I see, for example, Japan could just take a serious consideration of China's application. If China's application to CPTPP will be taken into account, to be honest, I think that will be a very positive momentum to reshape the Chinese market economy, and also could get China acting, Takeshi, you mentioned, acting as a responsible global power.
Mm-hmm.
Richard? Or Tak, any view?
I'm sorry. Let me look. In principle, again, the idea of China being part of a regional trade framework, economic framework, in principle, it seems to me it's potentially a good thing. But again, I come back to practice. Let me just raise two issues that would have to be dealt with. One is respect for intellectual property. That has been a recurring problem in China over the years. Second would be the entire question of China's economic model. China continues to have enormous government support for state-owned enterprises and enormous government support for the economy more broadly, and particularly for new technologies. So the question is, how can that be accommodated, or can that be accommodated into a framework such as TPP? And the question is, it's not obvious to me. Also, there's the question of, if the United States were going to go into such an agreement, issues like labor and environment would become more important. And again, that would raise, I think, all sorts of questions as to whether China would be willing to meet those standards. So to me, it's not a, we can have the conversation, if you will, as if it were an academic question or a theoretical question. To me, it really depends very much on the details about what would be the requirements for, say, a Chinese entry or participation, and was China willing to meet them? So I think we ought to take a very practical rather than ideological approach to it. And again, look, and it's a slightly awkward conversation because the United States is not party to it. I believe we made a mistake in not joining it. And I think it's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it, whether the Biden administration would be prepared to apply for membership, and if so, under what conditions, what kind of reforms would it want in the charter? And then there's the question for the other countries about whether they would be willing to agree to such changes. There would obviously have to be something of a negotiation. And I would say in the United States, the consensus on trade, shall we say, is quite thin, and this cuts across party lines. There's powerful forces in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party that are not what I would call free traders. And I think there's another concern, which we haven't mentioned here, and let me just put it on the table, which is in the age of COVID-19, there's a lot of concern about two things. One is domestic unemployment, and the other is the risks of supply chains. And I think what we will see, and we're beginning to see around the world, is many countries trying to make themselves less vulnerable on overseas sources of supply. And they will start mandating degrees of domestic production of selected items. And the question is, how is that process to be managed? Because that's potentially a protectionist sort of direction. And I think that we may well have to contend with that, given what governments see as the lessons to be learned from COVID and the danger of being reliant on overseas sources for critical medicines or critical technologies or critical components.
That's very good. Tak,
please.
Yes. I think this question is so tough for Japan. Right, Feng? Because China is the foremost, for trading, and the biggest trading partner now. 1/4 of export from Japan is now to China. Having said that, I mentioned that we've been strengthening the ties with the United States in terms of security issue. So I definitely believe that China and Japan and other TPP countries should sit and talk as for the willingness of China to participate in the TPP. However, Feng, I have a very honest question for you. China has to demonstrate China will be heavily committed to the regional, at least, responsibility. Because up until now, we don't believe that China can accept, human rights IP protection, a lot of issues, and data flow. So how can you demonstrate that China will be committed? What kind of format you can guarantee that that will be no issue for China to join the TPP? That's my simple question.
Very good, Tak. Dr. Zhu, before you answer this, let me interject the second question from John Zinkin from Malaysia, or at least he's based in Malaysia. He said, and it refers to the discussion so far because he's put his finger on this issue. If multilateralism can only work if there's agreement on the objective that is supposed to deliver, what are the three most suitable objectives on which realistic agreement can be reached? So, Richard has put the issue on the table. We want rules. The question is who's going to enforce the rules and how can this be done, right? So what are the three objectives and where can the suitable realistic agreement can be reached? Dr. Zhu, why don't you start first, and then Tak or Richard can follow up.
Okay, let me briefly responding to Richard and Tak's question. I totally understand the concern from Richard. I think Richard is a long-time China observer. I'm very sorry that China is always a complicated story. So somehow, now I also see the international frustration over my country now is going deeper and broader. But to be a Chinese, to be honest, but still, by and large, China is a transformative power. Then my optimism to my country usually rests on the two things. One is how to get China move forward. Sometime we will see, we have a Deng Xiaoping-like, mastermind. He really knows how to redirect China into the sound direction and the trajectory. But on the other hand, then we will see, we also have to refer to another source to get China move forward. It is international pressures. So then I think the multilateral engagement and China's full exposure to international community serve some sort of very important pulling force. It's not just how say increase the China's exposure and also just get China inevitably, we say integrated into the regional and the global community. So that's why IPO issues, free data flow, and the protection of the some sort of privacy or other international recognized the rights. I also see such a France has never been opened wider for China. So then we recognize the urgency, we recognize some sort of a new bigger parallel behind that. If the China wants just how to keep growing up. So then, to be honest, IPO issue, I'm less concerned for the moment. Because if you're looking at the China's IPO law, it's a full, duplication of a Western legality and a legal discourse. But the problem is how to implement it effectively and fully. So then I also see such a China's entrance into the CPTPP process will be new big, pulling force to get China move forward. Then second is, for example, so how China could just keep the promise. Then we will see internationally commitment and involvement in the past 4 decades. Then we will see, yes, some occasions we'll see the China's withdraw and a step down, but mostly I have to say, when the China engage the world and the region, then more cases just showing there's no way China can back down. So then, Take, so your question is also very resounding for today's Chinese community. So we needed to keep the promise and keep some sort of such a injection of the confidence into the international community before the China could be fully adopted and introduced into current, very, very dynamic trading institutions.
Richard or Tak? Richard? Sorry, Tak, yeah, please.
Go ahead, Tak.
Well, simply, I definitely believe the framework of TPP rules, that's the huge, impact to the multilateralism, because including IP protection, data free flow, and labor protection and those things. I think how we can reach this kind of agreements shared with the big powers. So definitely this needs big powers like the United States and China to join. That will create the involvement of WTO in, down the road. So this question is very difficult. I can't squeeze to 3 points, but definitely we need enforcement. That's an issue. Who can enforce compliance of the rules? So I have no answer at this moment.
Richard?
Well, the answer is there isn't enforcement unless everybody were to say, here's a condition of joining and here's a condition of maintaining membership. And I think for this grouping, the question would be, what would it insist on with China, and and the United States has to decide, as I said, whether it is prepared to apply for membership. And I think going forward, trade blocs like this have to, among other things, think about whether they want to introduce climate-related criteria. If somebody produces something with coal and they want to sell it, say, into the CPTPP area, should there be a tariff that's attributed to it if it's produced with coal? That's a legitimate question. That's the kind of question these groups are going to have to deal with in the future. I don't think we're going to just think of climate. That's something that happens in the Paris talks. I think increasingly we're going to think about climate, sustainability, and so forth type issues that are fully integrated with trade. So I think it's going to get more, not less complicated. I think China has to, as Tak said, stop describing itself as a developing country. At some level, every country is a developing country permanently. But China's too big and too wealthy and too large to basically be treated as if it were, how would I put it, in American college sports, we'd say, as junior varsity as opposed to varsity. China has to step up to its responsibilities. And I think we have to be smart, the United States. I don't think we can go to the Japans and South Koreas and Indias and others and say, you have to cut off China or choose between us and China. That's a non-starter. That is not a serious position. What we have to basically say, most aspects of trade with China can continue if you want, but here in these areas of technology, for example, these are the areas that we believe it is essential that we have certain restrictions, either on technologies that can reach China or where China is permitted to have to invest in certain types of enterprises. And that's a serious conversation. And we also, I'd say one other thing, if we don't like certain things in China, if we don't like Huawei, and for good reason, I would say we don't like Huawei, then we need to develop an alternative. We need to be, if you will, pro-alternative, pro-American, working with our Asian partners, working with our European partners. If we don't want China to control 5G, then we have to come up with alternatives that are just as good or better.
Very good. Richard, you have just opened up the last question I think we only have time for, which is Alejandro raised. He said you referred to the lack of multilateralism in the tech sphere and how we need a new model for multilateral or stakeholder cooperation in this area.
Yep.
Given the US-China strategic competition in technology, AI in particular, and I think 5G you raised, what can be done to avoid decoupling in this area? Richard, you go first.
Okay, well, just to be clear, Andrew, when I was talking about multilateralism, the technology area, I wasn't so much speaking about this, though I could have been, but about the fact that the internet, the digital domain, has virtually no rules. It's essentially unregulated. We have major problems, for example, Russian interference in our political processes, cyber theft, so forth, and also real differences about, for example, the free flow of information. So To me, the question is, can we get some limited agreements in the space, even if we can't agree on everything? It'd be the equivalent of thinking about in the military or nuclear space, arms control. Are there some areas where we can build in or introduce a degree of regulation into the digital space where virtually none exists now? And I think that's a long-term but important project, even though I do not underestimate for a moment just how difficult and complicated and dynamic it is. More on the decoupling issue, I don't think decoupling is a serious option. I don't think it's a desirable option. China is too big economically, and we want China to have a stake in the world economy. So I don't see decoupling as desirable, but I do think, the analogy I use, I hope it translates well, is I don't think the analogy is one of divorce. I think, though, in certain areas, there may be a requirement for a degree of separation. Well, when people in the United States get separated, they then arrange for who sees the children when. And by that, I mean, so I think the United States and China and everybody in China needs to maintain an economic relationship. It's inevitable, it's desirable, but there will be areas where there need to be restrictions. So it's not decoupling, but there have to be certain limits, again, on what is allowed to reach China and what China has access to. But that, to me, is a consultation between the United States and its principal economic partners in Europe and in Asia. And I think that is essential, but it's not decoupling. What it is, though, is a selectively restrictive approach to economic ties with China.
Richard, I can't agree with you more on this issue, but Dr. Zhu and Tak?
Yeah, basically, I see, Richard's views is very purely American one, so I can totally understand. I also know how frustrated the Americans analysts have been to China. But the problem is, for example, open markets, free access, and even fair competition, they're all the rules set forth by US since the end of the Second World War. Then now US say, yeah, China is a violator, so then US should totally wash out the traditional commitments and just leave the China isolated and even high-tech and commercially contained. To be honest, I think it's totally unfair. Then if we're looking back the past 4 decades, Americans and the Japanese commercial engagement to China is most formidable force to reshape the China's skyline on all the fronts. But now just the Trump administration came to power, I think he's not just some sort of a new isolationist, populist, and unilateralist, and he also so emotionally just addressing China's US-China relations. Most important with a factor impressed me so much is Trump just trying to do pandemic retaliation to China, because back to the January, his re-election prospect had never been better and brighter. But after he just going down side with the popularity, he just set free some sort of anti-China, the punching. So then my view is this, Richard. My generation and my younger generations and me, in the past 4 decades, no force just to get China influenced them, the Americans' engagement to China. But less than 4 years, you say now China is a bad guy. We should totally reshape the rule and remake some sort of relations. But to be honest, the real result is it'll get a generation of Chinese see American as a Democrat beacon now is eclipsing. So what I'm concerned is US shouldn't just house arrest on your very delicate balance between China competition and the China interest. But most important thing is, I think US should also just be careful of your long-term such a enlightening influence to the Chinese people. one generation and after generation. So then it's not just my request for some sort of, we say, fair play. The international politics by nature is always dirty job. But the problem is, then we will see US-China relations, number one, number two, great power relations. We also should be careful about some sort of such a disastrous effects to the world in 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Tak, any views?
Yes, for the country like Japan and other countries who are more or less stuck in the middle between China and the United States, and decoupling is a real issue because we are always in a situation if we are asked if we choose China or United States in terms of technology. That's a reality for us. And it's not ideal and decoupling, but it's a plan B. We have to think about seriously what to do with the if it's the case of decoupling. That's my first point. Second, to Feng, I think what you're talking about is really great. I like it. But in reality, we see a lot of skirmishes in Senkaku Islands and Southeast China Sea. That's a reality. So how to talk about those small skirmishes? That's reality. It's happening. So that's why we can't really give a full trust to China because that's happening.
Yeah. Takeshi, I can't agree with you more. I think that Senkaku Diaoyu disputes is very inflammatory. Personally, to be honest, I really want China to ease down and just push gently, because it's a very, very decisive factor to affect our Japanese friends' mood and feeling. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, China by large is a transformative power. I have to say, Japan and the US outsmart Beijing a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
Let me just say one thing, Andrew. Can I say one thing?
We're very near, but Richard, you have the last word, and then I sum up. Okay. Great.
Now, first of all, thank you both. Thank you all for this conversation. Thoughtful and respectful. So thank you all. Let me just say three things. One is the U.S.-China relationship. It's in the interests of both countries that for all of our differences, for all of our competition, that the competition not get out of hand. The last thing we need is confrontation, and we don't want the competition or confrontation to be such that it rules out limited cooperation. It's a very different 21st century if the United States and China can cooperate, at least in limited ways, whether on climate change or North Korea or what have you. Second of all, though, there has been a change in American approach to China. And it will continue under the Biden administration. So I think it's wrong to think, some of the specifics will change. Certainly the means will change. Some of the emphases will change. But there is a surprising degree of bipartisan agreement now, a disillusionment with how China has begun to use its growing economic and military power, about some of its behavior in the human rights and political realm. And essentially the hope that as China integrated into the world and as it developed, it would play by the rules, it would become more open politically, less statist economically. There's I'd say widespread disillusionment with what's happened. And I would say as a result, I think the biggest change, well, let me put it this way. Donald Trump represented a very big change in the United States. It was for 4 years. Now we're going to return to something more traditional and familiar. Well, so I can't speak after that. I don't know what the future will bring after Biden. But I also think for China, Xi Jinping represents a significant change. Xi Jinping's China, in terms of its politics at home, what's going on in Hong Kong and with the Uyghurs, what's going on with the Senkakus, with South China Sea, with the border with India, with the economic focus. This is a different China. And what you're seeing in the United States, and I think in the region, is people are beginning to react to it. And they take your point. We don't want to have a black or white relationship. People are concerned with trends about what we're beginning to see out of China in terms of how it is acting within its borders and beyond them. And what it's doing is the reaction you're seeing in the United States, I would simply say, to some extent, if you'll pardon the expression, was made in China. And I think that's a subject that the Chinese need to reflect on because to some extent it will endure.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we don't have time, and this has been a terrific, timely and optimistic discussion at this pivotal moment. I think that's the comment, not from me, but from Mark Lawrence. I just want to say that this is a terrific, frank, and realistic discussion. You know, the issue as I see it is as follows. We have arrived at a very difficult time when everybody has national domestic problems and also global problems we can't solve. At least, you know, the Biden administration is moving towards a healing process within America and hopefully within the world. Now, what are the three major objectives that we need to deal with? Number one, there is inequality. Inequality not just within countries, but between countries. Number two, there is global warming, which is killing all of us. And we don't deal with it, and we can't solve this by individual country. And number three, if we don't get the trade engine growing, and Victor is the big proponent of this, and I'm sure all of you, if we don't get trade going, if growth does not come back, everybody loses jobs, everybody loses, all right? So we you know, if I may sum up, we are at a very difficult time. There are three things that I think I heard recently, which I thought was super on this multilateralism issue. Number one, we need to listen more, okay? There are great fights between great powers, but even small powers need their strategic space. If we clash over these strategic space, we're all goners. So the second issue is not just listening, but also on how do we cooperate under this very difficult tension. And I agree with Richard, decoupling is not the answer. Separation may be, but decoupling cannot be the answer. And the third one is, we can't think in short term. We can't think about I. How do we think about the long-term issues, which realistically we must all solve? Now, there's no theory in this game. Multilateralism, as Richard says, quite right, is a means to an end. But the means to an end is to greater prosperity, greater equality, greater respect for everybody else. That's a conversation that the Asia Global Institute is trying to engage. This is no longer a monologue. This is not even a dialogue. It's a multiple conversation that will be continuing. And I want to thank all three of you for making a superb contribution to this. And I think, unfortunately, due to time, we must stop here. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for giving the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you.
Richard, great to see you. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Enjoyed it.
Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Be well. Be safe and well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.